Hello and welcome to NewsClick's special coverage of Budget 2022. And today I have Professor Vikas Rawal and I have Dipa Sinha. And yesterday we focused on the larger issues, or let me say the macro issues that were part of the budget, whether there's been excess spending or whether there is enough spending, what is happening in terms of capital expenditure. But today we want to look at two things which are important, which affect our economy. And we want to see whether the budget tackles that at all. And you know that in India, we've had these long, almost 1 year long farmers' protests against those three farm bills which had come in, which was broadly trying to uh, uh, hand over the farm sector to big companies. That is what was going to happen there. And farmers protested against that. They said that we want a minimum support price. And the government actually said that although they're not going to put it in the bill itself, but minimum support price is not going to go. So farmers, have they got anything? Because remember that the prime minister withdrew those farm bills and effectively said that he could not make farmers understand that these farm bills were good for them, and the government was never going to go back from its commitment to giving farmers a basic support. So what does the budget do there? And another thing that when we look at unemployment, we tend to forget that in India, the biggest victims of unemployment are actually women, because they have a higher unemployment rate, and yet they virtually don't come to look for jobs, paid jobs. They don't even turn up to look for paid jobs because they've completely given up hope. So India has one of the worst women's labor participation rate, and it has a very, very poor employment rate, even amongst those who come looking for jobs. So I'm going to focus today on these two things, and I'm going to start with food and farmers. So let me go to Deepa Sinha first. You, Deepa, work on food security, and then I'm going to come to Professor Rawal on specifically on what is happening in terms of MSP. So let me start with this first thing. When we look at the food subsidy, right? We look at food subsidy in terms of what the government wanted to spend in 21-22. They, I think, ended up spending 4 times. A part of that might have gone to retired FCI's debt, but even in terms of spending, it seems to be more than what they had budgeted for. And this time they've curtailed that drastically. What is, in your opinion, the impact on, let's say, food security, or in terms of giving food, cheap food to people, or subsidized food to people? Should we go by the budget estimate, or is the budget estimate deliberately kept low to show a lower fiscal deficit, lower spending?
Anindyo, I think it's a bit of both. The budget estimate also tells us some bit on the intent of what the government aims to do this year for food security, which we can kind of triangulate with everything else they have been saying. So, like you said, 2 years back, the food subsidy was really high, and most of it, in fact, more than half of it, went in repaying old loans. And that I think was using the opportunity of COVID, where you had more fiscal space to kind of do away with things that you had done in the past. This year, the allocation, which is about 80,000 crores less than the revised estimate for 21-22, if you look at that figure of about 2.06 lakhs, which is the food
Yeah.
subsidy estimate this year, that's just about enough to meet the commitments under the National Food Security Act, which is
Yeah.
something they have to continue doing as long as the act is in place, unless they amend
Hmm.
that. The additional amount is what has been given in different phases under the Pradhan Mantri Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana as additional
Hmm.
free grain as COVID relief.
Yes.
And this was after the second wave announced till December. And in December,
Hmm.
they said they would extend it till March, which was
Hmm.
clearly aimed at the elections. But
Yes.
now that the third wave has come and pandemic has not ended, we do need that to continue. But if you look at the
Hmm.
budget figures, it seems like they'll probably after March not continue this additional free grain, which is COVID
Hmm.
relief. I think that
Hmm.
is what is going to be hit. And all the field surveys are showing that those who have ration cards, this additional grain is really what is keeping them from starvation.
Hmm.
Because jobs have been lost, people don't have money, they are
Hmm.
not eating dal and vegetables and many other things, but basic
Yeah.
food grain is being met because of this grain that is being given.
Right. So let me move from there straight to the issue of farmers, because you mentioned that loss of jobs, right? Loss of jobs. And from the data that we've seen coming out of CMI for the last several years, in fact, even before COVID came, from the middle of 2018, 19, we've seen a transfer of people moving from non-farm sector back to farm, right? And as a lot of people have argued that this is essentially a form of disguised unemployment, even though in terms of employment figures, it appears that there are a lot of people getting work in agriculture. Effectively, they've lost work elsewhere. They've gone to agriculture. And we've seen that happen throughout the COVID period. Yet, if we look at the farm sector, now that so many more people are dependent on it, there is nothing in the budget that either speaks for farmers, and virtually there doesn't seem to be any allocation for even something like MSP. Professor Rawal, how do you see that?
Anindyo, I think there are two, 3 points that I want to make. One, I mean,
Yeah.
broadly, the first thing is that this is a seriously anti-farmer budget. I mean, after what has happened over the last year and a half, to present a budget like this, in which there's something like 26% cut in the funds allocated for agriculture, over 1 lakh crores have been cut. One is talking of a budget that's like seriously anti-farmer. That's one. The second thing is that we need to understand what has happened in the agricultural economy. You see, we are in and food economy. Taking from the point that Dipa just made. You see, we are a country where the government is sitting on over 100 million tons of food grain. You see, between 2020 and now, over this period of pandemic, government had hoarded an additional 20 million tons of grain. I mean, there was a time a couple of months back when our food stocks hit 120 million tons. Okay, this is the record high for India's history. This is the highest food stocks by any agency in the world. This is the highest food stocks of any country in the world. And we are doing this at a time of such crisis. This is incredible. I mean, it shows how anti-people this government has become. That you are sitting on mountains of grain and you have not even
And not distributing it.
You are not distributing it. You are accumulating more. And you could have run a massive food for work program with this grain. You could have said, we are going to double employment creation under NREGA by paying 50% of wages as grain.
In grain.
You could have done all kinds of things with so much grain you had. Okay, you don't do anything. You are just sitting on it. Now, by sitting on that grain, one thing you're doing is that you've cut the food subsidy expenditure, but the bulk of what is being spent on food subsidy is actually being spent on just maintaining that grain. It's storage and warehousing where you're spending bulk of your food subsidy. Now,
okay, that is an important point for our viewers to understand, that even where the food subsidy is being shown, you're saying a large part of it is simply maintaining what you're storing, and it's not actually the cost of distributing free food to people or subsidized food. It is simply the cost of storing.
If government today gives that grain away for free, it would be saving money. It would be saving money because you are actually spending money on hoarding it. Okay, so government's food subsidy bill would actually fall if you decided that 50 million tons or 60 million tons you're just going to give away for free. Okay, now in addition to this, it creates another peculiar problem. You see, wheat and rice.
I'm going to interrupt you there just for our viewers. If you could give us an estimate. So if let's say 100 rupees is the food subsidy bill, how much of it is actually just being spent on, and a rough figure would do. How much of it is just being spent to maintain and store things, just an administrative kind of thing?
I have not done that calculation recently, but my estimated would be like 70%.
70%. 70 out of 100 rupees.
Is just being held. The grain's just being held. The grain's not being distributed. Or what you are procuring, if you're going to hoard bulk of it, and that's an accumulated, that stock's accumulating, you see. So you are distributing what? I don't know, 30 million tons, and you're hoarding 100 million tons. You see? So you are actually stocking, and you're not letting it go. You are adding on to that stock. So it's cumulative. So there's huge amount of money being spent just on hoarding it. Now, in addition to this, what it does is, and this is, with wheat and rice are the most important crops. They are most
Yeah.
important crops for farmers. They are most important crops for consumers. You see, by hoarding this grain, you see, what you are doing is you're actually depressing open market prices, the
Yeah.
wholesale prices. The traders don't buy wheat and rice. So the farmers are where government procurement does not happen. Farmers are having to do distress sales because no trader is willing to buy rice and wheat because government is sitting on 100 million tons. So that this has meant
But
that there is.
won't it if the government did release 100 million tons, or let's say 70 million tons, won't that also have a impact on prices by depressing them?
Well,
Because won't
well,
there be a huge supply of food grain in the market, which will then depress prices in general?
if you had done it systematically throughout, you wouldn't have
Yeah.
reached this point at all. You see, now you can do all kinds of things. You can actually say, instead of distributing just rice, we are going to start distributing chana and tur in PDS and do procurement of those crops. You see,
Yes.
what if government said that we will procure chana, we will procure arhar, we will procure moong, and we will procure all kinds of other things, particularly pulses, and we will distribute along with 5 kilos of rice and wheat. We will give 1 kilo of dal to everybody. Okay,
Yes.
you would create incredible benefits, nutrition, farmers, profits to farmers. You will save on water
In a
if
sense, an incentive to produce pulses as well,
incentive to
because
produce
we
pulses as
end
well.
up importing.
Exactly. So the point is that if you had the intent to actually change agriculture, develop agriculture, you need to create that incentive structure, which would, on one hand, provide incentive to farmers to produce what the country needs, and on the other hand, create a way by which that what is produced by farmers reaches consumers at affordable prices. Now, right now, you are in a situation where the entire thing is broken. It's broken for farmers, it's broken for consumers. You have hunger. You have the highest hunger in the world, highest prevalence of hunger in the world, and you have farmers committing
You're
suicide.
sitting on food grain stock.
And you're sitting on mountains of food grain stock. So that's the situation right now.
Deepa, I just want to quickly bring in, we can keep going back to this topic as well, but I just want to bring in, and in a sense it is connected, the fact that women's employment is so low in India. And, there was a time when it was argued that as affluence is increasing, because of social reasons, women are coming out of the paid workspace and going back into the homestead. They're not going out to work anymore. But if that were true, then one would see that women's employment rate should have been higher. The unemployment rate should have been lower because there's certain things in which women work. So why, on the other hand, we actually see that the unemployment rate for women is actually much higher than what it is for men. And in a sense that if you look at it, the more distress we find at the lower end of the population, amongst the poorer lot, the less likely it is for women to be able to go out and work, because the more they, the entire, some of the women's work also involves opening up space for someone else to come and do the work. And that is true, especially in lower income groups, lower middle classes, where if a woman has to go out to work, they also need someone else to come and do certain kinds of work in the house or look after the children instead. And that's a kind of a double whammy, right? Because not only do women are not able to go out to work, but even a large part of women's employment, which is domestic work or personal services which they provide, non-professional, the work of a domestic help, even that is going away because families can't afford to hire domestic help anymore. So they're going back to the village, and we are seeing this vicious cycle take place continuously, which is in a certain sense tied to the entire idea of increasing poverty, increasing rural distress. So, what has the budget done, and has the budget even cared about this at all?
So the budget really doesn't seem to have cared about employment at all overall.
At all? Yeah.
Not just women's employment, but overall
Yeah.
employment as well is a problem in the country, and we have to
Hmm.
understand women's employment in that context of fewer and fewer jobs being created outside of agriculture. And what you were also earlier saying, that this return to agriculture is a move of distress as well, because there are no jobs available elsewhere. Given that context, there is also this other thing that you have discussed, that for many years now we are seeing a decline in women's workforce participation, and that there is enough research now to show that cannot be blamed on cultural reasons. That very much has to do with this fact that, again, that jobs are not available, that there were very few jobs being created in the economy, and the first jobs that are created and the better quality jobs that are created are usually captured by men. They are seen as the breadwinners. So if the man and the woman doesn't have a job, even for the household, it's a priority that the man first finds the job. Along with this, women have other constraints. Again, like you said, that they have, I mean, all the surveys also show that women say that they're willing to work, but they're willing to work more if the timings are flexible or the place of work is close to their home. And these preferences are usually because other social services are not available, and the burden of the household work falls on women. So we can look at many things in the budget also, which actually increases this burden of household work and unpaid work on women. For example, direct programs like creches and maternity entitlements. Over the last 4-5 years, you're seeing that the budgets for these schemes have been actually reducing even in nominal terms. Budgets for school midday meals, Anganwadis, these are things where if a child is getting a full nutritious meal in school, if the child is staying in school for 8 hours, that reduces the woman's burden of work at home. Budgets for these have remained, again, in real terms have gone down. In nominal terms, it's the same sort of number.
But the name has changed.
Name has changed, yes.
The good thing is that they've changed the
now
name.
a very respectable name. It's called PM Poshan. It was earlier called Midday Meal Scheme.
Midday
But
meal
that is-
scheme.
there is no
But the
change.
allocation is exactly the same, and therefore, if you adjust for inflation, it's actually going down.
Actually going down, and it's not even taking into account the fact that for 2 years children have not gone to school, and children's families have been facing this kind of economic crisis. So they have a learning loss to catch up on, they have a nutrition loss to catch up on. So if anything, you would add a breakfast, you would add an egg in that meal now that children are coming back. But you see that those budgets are not increased. Budget for LPG cylinders, again, that has a huge burden on women. If you look at the DBT for LPG, they're giving new connections, but they're not giving the DBT the subsidy. So cylinders have become so expensive. People have a connection, but they're still using wood.
I think they've reduced the subsidy even at a time when fuel prices, crude prices are going up.
Rising. Yeah, so again, that means women's time is now going back in collecting firewood and preparing the cow dung, which is the time they could have used for gainful employment. So there are all these indirect ways through which the budget, because it does not make sufficient allocations, is increasing the burden of unpaid care work on women, because of which they are not able to participate in the labor market. When they do, there are no jobs for them also. One other last point I want to make, which is again related to budget and women's employment, is that one area where the government can directly create good quality jobs for women, and they're very critical jobs, are your frontline workers, Ashas, Anganwadi workers, helpers, cooks. These are exclusive women cadres. All of them put together come to over 60-70 lakh women who are already employed. They have been working through the pandemic, and none of them are recognized as workers. They don't get a salary. They get an honorarium or they get an incentive, which often is not even as much as minimum wages. So on the one side, we are talking about women's contribution to the economy and providing decent employment. And on the other, the government itself is employing women, where it's saying they're not employing women. Women are being volunteers for the government. It shows the whole absurdity of the situation. And even as we speak, Anganwadi workers and Ashas are on strike in different parts of the country, and the budget makes no mention of them, does not allocate any budgets to increase their pay, which has been, again, stagnant for many years now.
I think one of the problems that the poor of India face is that there are no elections coming this year. After, in the next fiscal year, Virtually nothing except, I think,
Well,
Gujarat towards the end of the year.
We have UP and Punjab elections coming up.
No, no,
Yeah.
those are already covered in the previous budget, and they're probably going to spend much more in the run up because they didn't spend till November, December. So it'll be spent in these, and probably is already being spent in UP as we are hearing reports. But the question that, what both of you are saying is interesting because all the solutions that you're talking about actually don't require any money. I mean, at least not significant amount of money, because uh, um, if you look at distributing food, which is already lying there, there is a system of distribution available, and effectively, you can't even say I don't have money to give you because you're giving money to store food, but you're not distributing it effectively. As you said, that the cost actually would reduce, open up more fiscal space to do other things, but it's not being done. So in a sense, are even those who are heterodox economists, left economists, do they tend to miss the wood
No,
for the
no,
trees when they talk about fiscal spending not taking place? Because there are these solutions which
no,
can
no.
actually save a significant amount of money.
No, Anindyo, I think no, I think that's not the point. The point is no. One is that yes, there is a possibility of prioritization, that you prioritize people's welfare over corporate profits. Okay,
Yes.
yes, but that is not to say that there is not a need for there was not a need in this budget to expand spending to create consumer demand. Of course, there was that was the most critical and an important thing to do. You see, there are also other things where there actually money is required, and it's not just money. You see, look at fertilizers. Okay, it's a
Yes.
very interesting case. You see, over the last 1.5 year, there's been a huge crisis because government has done nothing to ensure supply of fertilizers. Over the last 10 years, India's domestic capacity for production of fertilizer has been seriously compromised. In the domestic space, it's increasingly privatized. So public sector is less has a smaller and declining share. Private sector is more, and we have become more and more import dependent. During the pandemic, there has been a huge disruption in global supply of fertilizers, and we don't have public sector with the same capacity to actually plan and secure supplies of either raw material or produce fertilizers, which has meant a huge crisis in the fertilizer sector. Government has been made forced to increase fertilizer subsidy
There
over
is
the last
subsidy.
2 years, but this year they've again cut it. They've again cut it,
So
not
that kind
realizing
of brings me back to a question that
not
I posed
realizing,
right at the beginning.
and they're not realizing that the structural problems that are there, which are causing fertilizer prices globally to rise, are not going to go away very easily or very soon. So next
No,
year,
but
you're
that brings me back to a question because, even as a person who, as a lay person, not an economist, someone who just reads up a bit, I understand that fertilizer prices are not going to go down. So I find it very difficult to believe that the finance ministry, with its entire team of people who monitor these things globally, have research people, data, that they don't know it. So it kind of brings me back to the original question that we seem to have seen regularly with this government that it announces less on certain things, probably to make international finance capital happy that they're not spending on subsidies, but they spend more than they actually announced.
That's
Repeatedly, they
not
keep
so
doing that.
well, on some things they spend more because there's pressure. On other
Yeah,
things, there's stress. So you don't spend on children. You don't spend on things that
exactly.
affect women. You spend on some other things which are politically high decibel.
Yeah.
So yes.
So the two things as far as welfare is concerned, where they said something and spent more, is Narega and PDS. Both of which,
Yes.
given the situation, was completely unavoidable. They should have done even more than what they did. Narega, there are
But
pending wages.
if I have to compare that with what UPA did, when there was a huge demand for Narega, you remember in 2011-12, after that they reduced it. So I
So,
think
so that is
UPA
also wrong.
consistently reduced its Narega outlay,
Absolutely.
and
We
in
are
fact they
the
spent. I mean, if you remember, there was a outlay of 40,100 crore, if I remember correctly, in 2010-11. but all that was spent was, I think, 28,000, 29,000 crore. So even when there was demand, the UPA wasn't spending and there would be backlog. I'm saying that there seems to be a political calculation here that subsidies do get you votes. And therefore, you need to spend it. You need to spend on the poorest, which keeps them at a subsistence level. Don't bother about employment. You can't create that employment. You need to keep the richest lot happy because they give you the money. But you also need votes from the poorest. So subsidies have to be given, but you can't announce them. So I'm just looking at, the fact that there seems to be no allocation for MSP. There seems to be, 80,000 crore was announced for fertilizers. They spent 1.4 lakh crore, right? So it almost seems to me that it is known that you'll end up spending some 1 lakh crore or 0.5% of GDP more on these things by the end of the year, but no point in announcing it right at the beginning.
Anindyo, I would not see it like that. If it was the case that the subsidies would get you votes, then you would announce it. The point is that you don't announce it. You don't want to do it. You don't want to give them. You give them because you don't have a choice. It's only under huge public pressure that.
But who in the village, which poor person in the village even knows that a budget is coming out, or even watches it or understands it? So you don't have to announce it in the budget. You basically do it on a hoarding later on, or when you go to campaign that I gave you so much free food, and you do it through state governments, BJP state governments. You've seen that happen repeatedly.
Well, the campaign goes, you see. I mean, if you announce something big, there are hoardings everywhere, and there's campaign on the TV that, Mr. Modi is doing this, that, and so on. So, I mean, it does reach people. So it's not like when they make big ticket announcements, they don't encash it. When they announce that they're going to have a PM Kisan, they get votes. So,
yes, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
So when they want to spend to get votes, they make big announcements and they spend it to get votes. When they're not doing that, they are actually announcing that we don't care, we are not going to give you money.
But is that the case? Again, if I look at Manrega, for instance, Manrega allocation, if I look at it, under the NDA, Manrega allocation has actually been much, much higher, even if you adjust for inflation, than the UPA, which came up with the scheme itself. If you look at even food subsidy bill has actually not gone up sharply during COVID. Actually, it did not, because a part of it was just things which you were paying FCI for, right? That subsidy existed. FCI was simply not being paid through the budget. It was being asked to take a loan. And at one go, you got rid of that using COVID as a cover. So I'm saying that there seems to be a very clear policy decision to not announce in things which do not reach people, like the budget, which actually reaches television studios and reaches, the brokerages of or big rating agencies. So you tend to keep that out of your budget when you know that all this will always go up, as it has for the last 4 years. If we go back and see, every year that has happened.
So two things I would like to say here. One is, in the case of Narega and food subsidy, you may be right that this year again they will spend more than what they've budgeted. And I think, but that would still be because there is popular pressure, and if there is popular pressure. Otherwise, they will not do it. The only reason they'll do it, like food, there was a lot of pressure. The situation was really bad. And I'm sure their feedback mechanism also told them in UP
that they have to do it.
Additional free grains was helping them. Why would they otherwise distribute with these photographs of Modi on the bags and continue it exactly to the month of elections? They're clearly doing it with a political agenda. But they wish they didn't have to do it, which is what we see in the budget estimates. This is what they would like to spend. But if they pushed, there is Narega, which is a demand-based scheme. There's food subsidy, where they're sitting on these stocks which they don't know what to do with, and they have to get rid of. So these two they might spend. But look at the other heads. This Jal Jeevan Mission, which last year they made such a big fuss of, and again this year. But if you look at the spending up to end of December, it's only 40% of what they allocated last year. So till the end of the year, we don't know how much they will spend. If you look at the actual expenditures of Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment,
I think they've more or less admitted that they'll not be able to spend the 50,000 crore. They said that in the revised estimate, I think it's 45,000 crore.
A big announcement there and keeping a cushion for themselves, which they also know they won't spend. They've not been able to spend the last 3 years. So what this budget tells us is what their true priorities are and what their intent is. In some things, they might have to make some changes. So you see that the budget for children as a proportion of the total budget is the lowest in 11 years this year.
Yes.
Last year was the lowest in 10 years. This year is a little lower. Gender budget, again, is a proportion going down. All this to me tells me what their priorities are. And they also prioritize these groups, but they didn't. That doesn't take away from the fact that this government is not prioritizing.
Yeah. I'd also want to ask you, let me start with Deepa on this. When one looks at the borrowing itself, right? The quality of that borrowing seems to have changed. I don't know if you've looked at it. There seems to be a lot more coming out of the small savings of public small savings than it had earlier. A significant chunk is actually coming out of that. Is there anything that you would like to talk about on that? Is there anything that is red flag there, Deepa? Or if you are not, if that is not something that you've looked at, Professor Rawal, does that worry you at all?
I have not looked at it, so I
all right.
Really want to make it. Yeah.
Just that SBI loans were entirely small savings funds.
Yeah.
Which seemed a little shady. Yeah. But
I want to come to the idea of taxes, right? And one of the things that some people have argued is that the tax collection going up at a time when the economy has not really recovered is a sign that only those who can pay have actually earned more, right? So that means that the rich have got richer, and at a time when the government should have given relief even on indirect taxes, it did not, and therefore GST collections have gone up, and maybe GST collections are catching up in certain segments as well. A lot of us tend to dismiss what we call the middle classes requirements, right? I know, Professor Rawal, you talked about stimulating demand. And in India, demand is not a homogeneous thing, as we all know, that if you give it to the poor, if there's more demand from the poor, then it probably spend it more on food and absolute basic necessities, right? None of which I think corporate sector is interested in, beyond a point, right? India's corporate sector is not interested in it, and the public sector has more or less been dismantled, so there's nothing that they can produce to help the poor. There is a certain amount of middle class demand which used to exist, especially during the boom years of 2004 to 2008, when there was a credit driven, or let's say market valuation driven salary boom. There is no change in taxes. And I know this sounds like a very middle class demand, but tax slabs have not kept pace with inflation. So in real terms, many more people are ending up in the taxable income limit, even when their real income hasn't gone up at all. So can you expect demand to go up from that space at all if there is nothing given to them in terms of tax relief? And here I'm not talking about the richest people. I'm saying that they're at the margins. Maybe they don't contribute a huge amount to the total tax that the government collects, but at the margins, at the bottom level, at that 2.5 lakh per year, up to that 5 lakh or a little more, what you gave 5 years ago is still the same. And in terms of real income, it would be much lower today.
Anindyo, I think one point I would like to make is that what is often referred to as middle classes in India, by no means middle. I mean,
absolutely.
A person who has a salaried job that gets you even 20,000 rupees, 10,000 rupees a month, you are rich. I mean, if you are in a village and you have a monthly fixed salary of 10,000 rupees, you are well off.
But if I look at, let's say,
You know,
if I look at urban India, then frankly, a household income of less than 25,000
yes,
is not
but
something with which you can really buy anything.
that's right. But that said, the levels of inequality in this country are such that the proportion of households that have monthly income of 25,000, you're talking of top 20%.
I think it's. I think
80% of
if you look at World Inequality Database, it's just the top 10%, broadly.
top
10%.
10%. So,
Yeah.
so you see,
Yeah.
you're talking of a very small percent of Indian households that have that kind of incomes. You see, now, if it comes to demand, the real demand comes from that bottom 90%. And that
But what
demand,
demand? What can they buy?
I mean, you see, your corporate sector is also producing Parle-G biscuits. Your corporate sector is
Yeah.
also producing clothes, banyans, and underwears and towels that
But are
everybody
they?
wears.
Are
You
they?
see,
Because the question, if I look at what, let's say, something like Hindustan Unilever, right? They actually sell sachets at a loss. If you look at it, if you actually bought sachets of shampoo instead of a bottle, you'll spend less. You'll end up spending less than buying a bottle. And technically, a larger volume should be cheaper, but it
when
isn't,
one is
right?
talking of manufacturing sector, it's not just Hindustan Lever. I mean, there is that huge MSME sector. There is
Yeah.
a huge set of actually larger enterprises which are not Hindustan Lever that are producing all kinds of things and are facing a huge demand crunch. You see, so
Yeah,
I
I think
think
corporate India understands this. If you look at I think it was on NDTV, you had Naina Lal Kidwai representing FICCI. She asked for an expansion of Narega and an urban employment scheme, saying that we need demand. So the poor are
But
a
you know,
huge
that's precisely what I'm
disadvantage.
saying. That it sounds to me, it sounds that these are untested arguments, because what is the 100 days of work at what wages? What can you buy with that? I
well,
mean,
you
There
still
is
need to,
nothing to do
you
here.
still
2017
need to
tells us
buy
that
sugar, you
30%
need
of
to buy
households in
salt.
rural India earn less than 2,500 rupees a year, a
Yeah,
month.
but
With
you
that,
still,
what are you
if
going to
you
buy?
break your
You can
brain
do
from
as much
PPS,
Narega you want. It's not going to change anything as far as
no, no,
corporate
if you
India or
break
the
your
manufacturing
brain
sector
from the
does.
PPS, that Narega wage will be used to buy hair oil, shampoo, soap, dal, sabzi, oil, a school uniform maybe for the child. They've not bought clothes for children for the last 2 years.
But you know, one
This
needs to
all
just
the things
add
the
these.
poor buy.
There is an
These
argument to be made here that they'll buy Chinese products, and nothing is that made in India, because it's cheaper to buy Chinese products,
that
right?
raises questions on
I
our
mean, you go to a Shani
manufacturing.
Bazaar or a one of the Sunday market in Delhi, right? You'll find everything is made in China. Poor people just buy that because it's cheaper. So
Yeah,
I'm
no,
saying that,
that
do we
is
even
different
have
question.
capacities? I'm saying,
Yeah.
do we even have capacities to actually deliver products
Yes.
to
I mean,
people if you actually generate demand amongst the poor? I don't think we have it.
well, I mean, if you are saying that there is creation of demand that an Indian entrepreneurs will not rise up to produce those goods, I mean,
Yeah.
then, I mean,
They can't
what does it
compete.
say?
What I'm saying is that what would it take? So let's say, let me ask you, Deepa, if you were finance minister, what would you have to do to both generate demand, but also ensure that it's not demand for Chinese and Vietnamese goods?
See, that is, you need a longer term industrial policy, and that lot of people have been talking about. But currently, is that the context? I mean, there is so much excess unutilized capacity in the economy. Is it the problem
But
that we
of
have a
what? Of what?
bottleneck
Unutilized
that cannot
capacity is in steel and
or
cement and stuff like that. But what do we produce, which is installed capacity, which can be bought by poor people? That is my question. I mean, what can you do today? So, as I'm saying that, I have been writing for 3 years that, oh, we must spend. But when I look at the structure of production,
No, I mean,
manufacturing in India, yeah,
in sectors such say think of Tirupur or something, where there
yeah.
are textile enterprises. If there is greater demand for banyans, that manufacturing can happen in Tirupur. I don't think it is the case that there are no areas. There is surely need for government to strengthen, provide service, facilities so that MSME sector can expand. but
Yeah.
there is clearly a possibility for us to build, strengthen demand and create opportunities whereby those entrepreneurs can produce and sell. Of course, there is there is both existing capacity and huge unmet potential for government to provide basic infrastructure to MSME sector so that they can produce. I mean, cluster after cluster is facing a crisis. Okay, your foundries, your all kinds of sectors where things are produced, machinery. I mean, we used to do field work in Punjab in combine harvester manufacturing. These are small enterprises that actually just have bending machines and laser cutting machines and welding machines, and they manufacture agricultural implements, or a
Yeah.
village level, town level agricultural implement manufacturer. Okay, there is no demand for those implements because farmers don't have money to buy. Your 11 prong plow has broken down. You don't have money to get it repaired or buy a new one. Now, if you create demand, of course, that huge amount of manufacturing happens at the local level.
Also, demand for services, no? Things like a mechanic. Nobody,
Ah,
they're not getting their bike
yes.
out, they not get their bike repaired. The big construction boom in the UPA period, part of it was people building their own houses because they had money to do it. Usme they'll buy tile, they will do paint their walls, they do all kinds of things which people are not doing
But
now. So there is
okay.
enough. Of course, there are supply side issues, like Vikas said, but that's not so big that there is no point in creating demand at all, and that it will all only help the Chinese economy. I
No,
think that
I'm asking is essentially that is creating demand that easy, or does it require very targeted planning? I mean, is there a problem of having a budget when you've more or less dismantled the planning commission?
I think the question is not so creating nothing is easy in a country the size as ours, but it is necessary. I mean, there is no way we can get out of the situation we are in today without addressing the demand issue. We can't keep doing these credit supply side initiatives, credit linkages, and so on without addressing the demand side. We are somewhere we have hit that saturation. If it's only the richest 1% that is growing, and then maybe
Yeah.
the 10% a little bit, how long can we go on with that? We obviously can't, and COVID has kind of intensified things, and therefore it's
That
become even
problem.
more of a crisis. Yeah. So I
Well,
don't think
All
this
right.
is
I
going.
think
It's been
creating
Sorry.
demand, the basic of the root of it is straightforward. You need to spend. If you
yeah.
spend, you create demand. I mean, it's as simple as that. I mean, can you spend? Of course, you can spend. You've got food stocks lying. You can spend. As I said, you can simply double NREGA employment by saying we are going to give 50% of wages in terms of grain, and we are going to create double the amount of employment. Okay, so
And
so
so effectively, you're saying that if you combine spending by creating employment, as you said, Manrega is one of them, and there could be an urban version of, UREG, Mahatma Gandhi urban employment
All
guarantee.
vacancies in all government schemes and departments. That's a huge number.
yeah.
Just vacancies
Yes,
in science.
exactly. Yeah,
And that won't be the poorest. Those will be all above the 10,000 rupees per month
exactly. Yeah.
kind of employment.
So, and that is a huge number of vacancies, and there is a huge demand for it. We know that younger people actually now want government jobs, no longer want private sector jobs anymore, a majority, as the CSDS last survey shows. So effectively, there doesn't seem to be any kind of policy which actually looks at what to do, whether it is employment, and some of that employment, as you said, doesn't necessarily have to be just cash out. It can even be, if you give food, then there'll be a certain amount of less spending by those people, which they can spend on other things. And the other is spending itself is not directed at employment either, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
I
There
mean,
is
I see that there is a significant increase in, let's say, Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, right? And probably it'll be argued that this is going to generate employment, right?
well, I don't
But
know. No, you see, the problem is
Yeah.
that a lot of that spending, that sort of so-called increase in capital spending that was
Exactly. Yeah.
talked about since yesterday, is basically money being given for PPP projects. These are going to
Exactly.
be, I mean, that those 80 lakh houses that they want to build is going to be money handed out to real estate developers. You
Yeah.
see, you are not running an old style Indira Awas Yojana at all. You see, now what you have is a scheme under which developers are given money to create housing, which is actually beyond the reach of the poor. So you are actually, spending. I mean, all that road infrastructure that's going to be created will be money going in the hands of big construction companies. So how
Absolutely. Yeah.
and there the work is done using heavy machinery. It is not employment intensive way of doing things. This
Yeah.
sort of PPP mode is not an employment creating mode at all. It is money that goes into pockets, profits of corporates, real estate
Yeah.
companies,
Which is
and
why
this
whenever such schemes are
heavy
announced, stock
machinery.
markets, stock
Yeah,
prices of companies which sell cranes or
sure.
heavy machinery, those shoot up because
Yes.
even the markets understand that the spending is actually for such companies.
So
Yeah.
there's not the old style spending where huge amount of employment will be created. That's not true at all.
Hmm. Hmm. So it's effectively, if you had to look at the political fallout of it, and probably this is an unfair question to ask before we end the show. Politically, what is the fallout? Because this seems to be and the edge of a precipice, and we don't. There doesn't seem to be any way to stop what is happening right now. I'll start with Deepa.
What will be the fallout is difficult to say
Yeah.
because it's growing
Yeah,
more and
no,
more
I'm
difficult
going to
to
ask you to
understand
go
this,
out on a limb,
this
stick your neck out,
country of ours.
and take
But
a chance.
what is clear, and I think on this now there is more and more of a consensus emerging, is that there is an economic crisis, that this recovery or not has, I mean, that the last few years, the slowdown has definitely affected the poor much, much more than the top richest. That employment is a problem. We've seen the railway protests in Bihar, but all of these are issues. There is no doubt about it, and that people are agitated with about it. Also, there is no doubt. But will that convert into voting against the present government? That is something that needs to be seen, and that I think has to do also with how much the opposition is able to take forward these messages and the politics. Like you said, how does the people in the person in the village know what's going on in the budget? How does the person in the village also know that we have to thank Modi ji for our vaccine? It's because somebody
Yeah,
is campaigning and taking this message to
campaigning.
them.
Yeah,
The people
and as
who need.
long as the media plays the role of taking that message forward, the government always has an advantage.
Yeah,
Uh,
so one can only
hmm,
hope that all these opportunities that are created for the opposition in our country, with COVID, with unemployment, with demonetization, and so on, that the message is really taken to people, and then maybe there will be political
but
changes.
Professor Rawal, the point is that the opposition probably believes in exactly the same economic policies. So it's almost, I mean, most of the main opposition parties don't seem to have a problem with the policies themselves or the main thrust of the policies. They tend to nitpick when they're in the opposition. I saw Mr. Chidambaram yesterday talking about Manrega and how Manrega allocation has been reduced. He seems to have forgotten his fight with Jairam Ramesh over Manrega, how he said that Manrega is actually bad for agriculture. So the opposition doesn't seem to have, I mean, it seems like that this government can change, but as far as economic policies go, it'll be more or less of the same thing.
Well, I don't know. I mean, that depends on what happens, and I don't think one should rule out the possibility that there can be
A change of heart.
political change for the better. I mean, there can be political. I mean, I don't think I am willing to rule out the possibility that there can be change for the betterment of people. There can be change for which is progressive. How will that come about? There are, I mean, one has to see. Now, would it mean that more progressive political forces will have greater influence? Let's hope so. would it mean that political forces that were conservative in the past would learn their lessons? Maybe. So, I mean, I don't think we should rule out any possibility. We have to do what we can to do our bit in that direction. But I mean, I don't think we can be completely pessimistic that possibilities of progressive change don't exist and cannot happen. That's not the case.
All right, on that, sorry.
Pensions. I said Akhilesh has talked about bringing back pensions. So there is all kinds of things going on. We don't know what will happen.
All right, on that optimistic note, and also hopefully that, I mean, I don't expect anyone in the government to be watching this show, but hopefully wherever you're speaking elsewhere, it reaches those who are making policies, and at least these few things that you're talking about, which is distributing the food that's lying there, strengthening Asha, Anganwadi, giving more food to children. These things reach not just from us, but from everyone who's talking about it, because one can set one's politics aside. Ultimately, it's the people who need to get something immediately. Thanks a lot for joining us, and thank you for joining us on NewsClick. Keep watching NewsClick. This is our coverage of the budget 2022. Do subscribe to us and click that like button as well and share this video as well.